It is my honor and privilege to introduce our speaker for the day. She is Dr. Rebecca Dixon. She is a professor at Tennessee State University. She's a member of the Department of Literature, Languages, and Philosophy, and her field is in literature. She has a special interest in literature by authors with African American heritage within the post-colonial era. So please give a warm, welcoming applause for Dr. Rebecca Dixon. Dr. Dixon. Thank you.
So when I was constructing this presentation, I focused more on definition of diaspora. I do touch on aspects of beauty. So if there are questions at the end, please feel free to ask them. So this is a map of pre-colonial Africa. And generally when we talk about the diaspora, we're talking about those places that Africans have settled throughout the world outside of Africa. And generally, although there are differing definitions, we are not talking about Northern Africa, we're talking about Sub-Saharan Africa. And so we don't include in that the Moorish occupation of Spain and Italy, which, depending on the scholar you're talking about, ranges anywhere from a few years to 300 years to 700 years. Right? Generally, we're picking up with European exploration in the 15th century. And because of European exploration, we come into the slave trade. And if we go to the next, so European exploration, as I said, starts in the 15th century, primarily with the Spanish and the Portuguese. They were in search of gold, primarily, because they had heard rumors primarily about the ancient West African kingdoms, because, It's one of the great kings, Mansa, I'm fudging on his name, but he makes this Hajj to Mecca, displaying all the gold. And of course, Ghana, the country of Ghana, used to be known as the Gold Coast because of the wealth that exists there. So they were in search of gold. They also traveled to the New World, right? Because they had heard stories about the New World and the wealth there. And particularly, they were interested in mining and pillaging. But later, once we get the Dutch, the French, and mostly the English, because it's the British that do the most in terms of exploration and settlement. Once they enter into the picture, we get this idea of cash crops. And so Europeans figure out very quickly that they can make more of a profit if they settle New World territories and produce cash crops. And of course, this is, of course, leads into needing labor. And so now Africa had an internal slave trade, but the transatlantic slave trade, or what Europeans introduced, takes on a different system. And we can that's the internal slave trade is pretty much a different discussion. But what people in the transatlantic slave trade wanted was primarily males. They wanted males from around the age of 14, 15 to 25. When you look at the internal slave trade, what they want are female slaves because the purposes are different. So the settlements and you know about the settlements because this involves American history. So we have the colonies in the United States. And most of the time when people talk about diaspora, they're talking about those settlements. They're talking about settlements in the United States. They're talking about settlements in the Caribbean. They don't so much talk about South America, although when we talk about the slave trade and we talk about the triangle trade, more slaves were brought to South America than anywhere else in the New World. But what you saw was that Europeans were making a profit, settling the territories, cultivating things like rice cultivation, tobacco. Later would come cotton, and primarily in the southern part of the United States and the Caribbean, sugar. Sugar was a major export. And so this is a part of the shaping. Now, this is one aspect of the shaping of the diaspora. And if we look at,
Next one.
yeah. This is a great one because it shows enslaved populations and the people responsible for it. The next one shows where in West Africa most of the Middle Passage, which is the next slide, where the ethnic groups come from. And this is a great, you've probably seen this in books on the slave trade. When we talk about the Middle Passage, we're talking about a part of that triangle trade. And that's took anywhere from 4 to 6 to 10 weeks, this journey from the coast of Africa to primarily the Caribbean, where slaves were broken in. This is where they were seasoned, and either they were taken to South America or they were taken to North America. And you can see, and this is, of course, a part of the damage that was done to Black people, the way in which, because those images are people. So this is about the packing in of people, and that can be, of course, psychologically damaging. The next slide shows another one of these, and it's hard to see it, images of what those slave ships would look like in terms of packing Black people in. So, and then if we go to the next slide, yeah. So during this period, and this is a major period in terms of the shaping of diaspora, it's also a period where we get to know what is, diaspora is also, when we think about diaspora, we generally think about African people and their heritage. But diaspora is responsible for our concepts of Blackness and whiteness, right? How we think about race, which is primarily artificial, stems from this period of enslavement. And we have one of the great writers of the diaspora is Olaudah Equiano, and this is one of the canonical texts that most people read that tells us about the transformation. There is a great deal of literature about slavery, but not so much about the Middle Passage during the enslavement period. So Olaudah Equiano's text, which was written in the latter part of the 18th century, distinguishes itself for that reason, because it talks about his life in Africa, talks about African civilizations. So it works to counter some of the justifications for slavery, talks about cultural practices among the Igbo, of which is modern day Nigeria. And then, of course, his capture, and then his journey, and then his eventual freedom. It does touch on some aspects of beauty, because we see the differences in Equiano's text about how Blackness and whiteness are understood, right, by both Europeans and by Africans. And you see Equiano's transformation in terms of his assimilation to Western culture in the latter part of his narrative. But there aren't a lot of texts during the enslavement period, even though the enslavement period is one in which you see a retention of African concepts of aesthetics, right, which has to do with beauty. But the notions of beauty, of course, are undermined and in some ways transformed by slavery and the Western experience. But you do still have some retentions, particularly in art, right? So art serves, in terms of West African culture, the aesthetic says that art must be functional, it must be collective, it must be committing, it must serve some type of function for the people, right? It has to speak to the group values and their identity. That's a part of the collective. And in terms of committing, it has to show an appreciation for the artist's perspective or gain the the audience has to have an appreciation for the artist's perspective. And you see that somewhat in early African American art, but it gains momentum and becomes a part of most African American writing has that type of polemic. But there are a few writers that have touched on, I guess, this concept of the diaspora. One of them is in the Renaissance period. That's Countee Cullen. I didn't have a slide for him, but his poem Heritage touches on this tension between those aspects of African culture that have been retained and Western influence. The next major movement that impacts this understanding of diaspora is colonization. And colonization takes place around the same time as the slave trade, right? When the slave trade was going on in the 15th century, 16th century, 17th century, what you saw on the coast of Africa were mainly post, right? You didn't see settlement. But as we get into the 18th century and the 19th century, you begin to see settlement of Africa. In the latter part of the 19th century, in the fall of 1884, winter of 1885, you have what is known as the Berlin Conference, where Europeans carve up Africa. And by 1914, all of Africa has been colonized by Europe, with the exception of Liberia, which started as a colony, and then, of course, you have Ethiopia, which remained free, except for the northern part, Eritrea. But the rest of it, and you don't see in this map some of the country formations. One of the things that you do note, or you should note, is that the country formations, in many respects, are artificial. So if we did go back to that first map of Africa, you can see that there are some centralized kingdoms, but they don't look quite like the countries that we have with colonization. And as a result of colonization, and remember, you had colonization in Africa, but you also had colonies in the Caribbean that were, and so as a result, even after slavery, one of the things that you see is this idea of Western influence, and it varies from culture to culture. Among the French, and what's the next one? Yeah, no, that's okay, you can stop with him. Among the French, the idea is that among the French colonies, whether they were in the Caribbean or Africa, the idea is that they were going to assimilate Africans, that they were going to be Frenchmen. And so one of the markers of prestige in a French colony was for your son or daughter to study in Paris. And so as a result, in the 1930s, we have a movement called the Negritude movement. And this is very much a movement about recapturing African concepts of beauty. So this idea of assimilation meant the disavowing of African culture and replacing it with those things that were European or a European aesthetic. The Negritude movement was inspired by, and that's why I mentioned the Harlem Renaissance. They were inspired by the Harlem Renaissance because it takes place a few years after the Harlem Renaissance, right? They were inspired by surrealism, they were inspired by communism, but mostly they were inspired by their African heritage. And so there were three writers. This is Aimé Césaire, who's from Martinique, who went to Paris and studied there. And some of you may know Aimé Césaire for his notebook on a return to the native land, where he talks about the problem of being Black in Western society and the way in which it affects this issue of identity, self-concept, which of course are related to beauty, but the idea of how do you take pride in your culture or yourself when you're being educated to believe that another way of being and looking is supposed to be superior. So this is Leopold Senghor, who some of you know as the first president of independent Senegal, of course, which was a colony of the French, gained independence in the 60s. And so he was also one of those people who studied in France and is known as a great poet. He's also known as the father of the Negritude movement. And the next writer, this is Léon Damas, and you can see the Eiffel Tower in the background for him. He's the first to publish among the Negritude writers, and his writing, if you have time to look him up, he has this poem called Hiccups, which really, although some people say it's not as refined as Césaire or as Senghor, it really does get at the agenda of the Negritude movement. And then, of course, what we have among the British. The British, as I said, were the most aggressive in terms of colonization. And they continued, even after the enslavement period, to colonize. And, of course, the main objective was profit. But there again, you see this idea about the diaspora transforming. The British, for a long time, you didn't see a great deal of black presence in England. There were some periods, I want to say this is the 18th century, where there was this trend of keeping little black boys. So during the enslavement period, you saw it become in fashion for wealthier people to have a little servant black boy. Later, when they got older, it's not clear what happened to them because they did not keep them in the household. But the early black presence in Britain or England, rather, you don't see too much of. But after World War II, England needs workers to help rebuild. And so what they do is they solicit the help of African peoples and also Asian people from the places that they colonized. And they offer them citizenship. So you had people primarily from the Caribbean going to England and helping to rebuild England after World War II. And as a result, you have writers, one of which I noticed on your schedule, you're reading Zadie Smith. Her people are a part of that great movement, right? Not her, because she was born in England, but her parents before her would be a part of that movement. And one of the other writers, this is Carol Phillips, who was born in St. Kitts, went to England with his family in 1958, and his 3 other brothers were born in England. He writes about the diaspora. So he's one of the few, I guess, contemporary voices that you get that write about the diaspora. His books, Cambridge, and Cambridge is set during the enslavement period. Higher Ground, which is also set during the enslavement period, but is one of the few novels that tells you about the slave forts on the coast of Africa. But anyway, he also writes about the Black British experience because he grew up in England. His more recent works talk about what it's like and are based on the experiences of Black people coming from the Caribbean, settling in England, but also Black people coming from the west coast of Africa and settling in England. And there's a couple of other. Joan Riley is also a West Indian writer. She's from Jamaica, and she writes about more the psychological impact, the promise, and this is again the idea, even though the British weren't big on assimilation, but the idea, just like with the French, was that England offered certain promises. And so for many black people living in the Caribbean who had been colonized by the British, who went through British education, which celebrated English identity and culture, when they went to England, they had certain expectations, but were met with a great deal of hostility and racism. So her book is a rare one. I don't even think it's in print, but you can get used copies of that one. And then this guy, Chris Abani, he's a Nigerian author. Some of you may know him for his other texts that are about the Nigerian Civil War and the aftermath of the Civil War. But this text, Becoming Abigail, is about a Nigerian girl that goes to England. And it has some parallels to the Unbelonging text in terms of her feeling like an outsider and its impact on her self-concept. I think, yeah. There's another text, and I didn't get a slide of it. The author's name is Andrea Levy. And again, there's been a movie made of her text. It's called Small Island. And again, we're talking about the sense of identity, learning to appreciate and celebrate English identity, and then moving to England and being met with racism. So in terms of diaspora and in terms of the shaping of identity, so you have the enslavement period, which is one part of it. You have colonization and then the migration, which are another part of it. And then today you have a new diaspora. There are some other movements that fall in between, and we could talk about that later if you want. But the one that you have today is another diaspora. Some people refer to it as a new diaspora. And you have large communities coming out of Nigeria, coming out of the Sudan. And so this touches on other parts, because the traditional understanding of diaspora is about West Africa. But in the new diaspora, you see people coming from Ethiopia, Somalia, even Egypt, even though traditionally we don't deal with North Africa. Even some from Kenya, right? So that's the idea about diaspora. And I don't know if there are any questions. Yes.
When you refer to the new diaspora, where are they going?
Oh, so they're going to various places. And here in Nashville, we do have a sizable communities of diasporic Africans, particularly in the Laverne area and in the outskirts of the city. New York, Atlanta, Washington, D.C., right? But they're spread out, so it's surprising. You'll find in Texas large communities, right? So, but they're mainly going to the major cities along the eastern part of the country. Yeah. Yes?
Why is it that you mentioned that we don't normally deal with North Africa in terms of the diaspora. Why is that?
Well, it has to do with the Arab influence. So when you look at the cultures of the sub-Saharan part of Africa as opposed to the northern part of Africa, in terms of the last 500 years, you see more of a Middle Eastern cultural influence as opposed to the southern half of Africa or the rest of Africa. And so the cultural differences tend to be very different. Northern Africa, you tend to have majority Islamic influence, whereas in sub-Saharan Africa, it varies. There are some countries that, especially along the West Coast, where you see, like, for example, Nigeria, you almost see a 50-50 split among Christian and, well, it's not 50-50, it's like in the 40s, 40-some percent Islamic, 40-some% Christian, and then you have indigenous religions. But most places in sub-Saharan Africa, you don't find as much of the Islamic influence, and Islam has a heavy cultural significance in terms of the building of the culture, right, of those places. Just like when we talk about the Moorish influence in Southern Europe, you can still see aspects of it, particularly in the architecture. It's so it's very dominant and domineering in terms of how it shapes the identity and culture, and so you don't see that as much in sub-Saharan Africa. Yes.
The racism factor of Europe and also here.
Mm-hmm.
I'm wondering if that is the same in South America, where so many slaves went.
Mm-hmm. Well, you have a different type of dynamic because, of course, in North America, or rather in the United States, for the most part, you didn't have black majorities. You did early on have places where there were black majorities, but the Negro Act ensured that they would import more Europeans, so to diffuse those places where you had majority black populations, and that affects the way in which white slaveholders and black people interacted, right, and negotiated in terms of freedom, in terms of identity. So those places in the United States where you did have black majorities, you tended to either have very stringent laws in terms of slave practices and freedoms, or you tended to have a lot of freedom. For example, the Sea Islands, where black people were abandoned, right? And so you saw a great deal of freedom there. But, for example, in New York, where you did have, my students are always surprised about this, where you did have a sizable slave population, after the Negro Act, you tend to have very restrictive laws. But when you look at South America, in particular Brazil, you tend to have more leniency, you tend to have more of the church involvement, the Catholic Church involvement, you tend to have more gradual manumission, but you also tend to have more problems in terms of self-concept, right? So you have so many different understandings of identity, right, in terms of mixed populations, whereas in the United States, the concept of identity was very much black and white, right? You had these absurd type of identifiers during slavery. They're not absurd, but they speak to the absurdity of race, right? So you had these ideas like that somewhat reflect what you had in Brazil, but not as complicated. So you had the concept of the mulatto, because miscegenation was widespread. And that had to do with the heavily male presence in the United States, right, among Europeans. So the few black women that they brought early on were sexually exploited, even though the law said that this was against the law. And you know this because of the new film. We had laws against interracial marriage and relations up until the 1960s. You know this movie Loving is about that, the new film. But you had the mulatto, which was half black. You had the quadroon, which was a fourth black. You had the octoroon, which was an eighth black. And of course, the idea is that, you know, if you are biracial or a mulatto, we don't use those terms anymore, one of your parents was black. If you are a quadroon, that means that one of your grandparents was black. The other ones were white. If you are an octoroon, that means that one of your great-grandparents was black. The other 7 were white. And then, of course, you can go back to 1/16th black, 1/32nd black. Depending on where you are, people will talk. And they took records of this, right? It wasn't as if, you know, when we get to the 20th century and we talk about the issue of passing, people can get away with it because you have anonymity, right? You go to the city, nobody knows you. But during the time of the 18th and 19th century, people lived in smaller communities. Slaveholders took meticulous records of what they did, of what they owned, of how you came to be. So, but those ideas are really speak to how this idea of, as I was saying before, blackness and whiteness are really concepts of the diaspora. And it lets you know how ridiculous they are. How much white blood do you have to have in order to be white? And then, of course, once we get to emancipation, we get the one-drop rule. So if you have any amount of black blood, you're considered to be black, which of course is a part of this idea of the aesthetic and beauty, because the idea was to venerate those things that were white and to denigrate those things that were black. And that stays with us to this day, which means that I don't necessarily buy into the whole idea of complete self-hatred, such as you get with a writer like Toni Morrison in Their Bluest Eye. I think that there's more attention, which is what you see in a writer like Gwendolyn Brooks, her novel Martha. You see this tension because wherever you go, there is this, even today, and all you have to do is turn on the local news, there is a celebration of what is white, and then there's a denigration of what is black. And so people tend to learn or be socialized, even if you don't go through public schools, which do it too, right? There's a celebration of what is European, and then there's no mention of any contribution that black people have made, even though black people have just as much of a strong intellectual heritage, despite laws that said that black people couldn't learn to read and write, as white people. But you don't learn anything about black people up until you get to Martin Luther King. And then all of a sudden, black people exist in some form outside of slavery. But just for example, in terms of the television, one of the things I notice is that, especially the local news, they go out of their way to talk about crimes where black men have committed crimes against whites. And they'll look for these crimes outside, even if they're outside of Nashville. You'll get confused because you think, oh, I thought we were in Nashville, but it's not. It's somewhere in the Northeast or somewhere in Ohio. Then they also will have features on whites who have done good things in the local Nashville community. So you get this idea about how black people are supposed to be criminals and don't do any good things, but you don't get as much about whites having been criminals, even though we know that, not that we want to hear about people committing crimes, but we know that crime generally occurs within the same race. So those cases of interracial crime are sensationalized cases that the media picks up on because people like that. They like to believe in those stereotypes that emerge primarily during the antebellum period in this country to justify slavery, and afterwards. They like to believe in those stereotypes because they're exciting, they're fun. They don't have a lot to do with the reality. Or they make people feel comfortable. It's comfortable to be able to categorize people in certain ways and to feel self-assured about who we are as people, right? So, and this is what I mean by diaspora shapes how we think of blackness and whiteness. I'm probably over time. I'm sorry.
Hey, doctor. Thank you so much. Thank you for coming. Appreciate you. Help me. Thank you. Thank you again, Dr. Dixon. That was very insightful, very